I am back.
Hi.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Hi.
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 Hi. All right, ready?
Yeah. Hello and welcome to Witch Please, a fortnightly podcast about the Harry Potter world. I'm Hannah McGregor.
And I'm Marcel Cosman.
Today we're bringing you our discussion of part 2 of the newly released Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. And I don't know about you, Marcel, but I'm getting deep into the fan fiction aesthetic. I'm shipping things all over the place. I'm shipping my microphone and my audio recorder right now.
Sexy.
At first, they seemed like enemies, forced to work closely together, but resenting the proximity. But over time, not despite but because of their differences, they found themselves drawn to one another.
I'm pretty sure you're doing that wrong, but don't worry about it. We'll get you sorted out. We'll get you sorted out in the sorting chat. So we don't have a whole lot to cover in the sorting chat, mostly just 3 things that we couldn't find anywhere else to stick them. So I want to start with a question, and it is, what the heck is Lily doing strolling around Godric's Hollow with baby Harry when they're supposed to be hiding from Lord Voldemort?
I mean, she's providing stage business, I guess. Okay, so you propose that possibly all of Godric's Hollow is protected, which is obviously not the case.
It's for sure not the case.
So it's just that one house which was hidden and made to look like a different house. Mm-hmm. So they just went out for a quick walk.
Just out for a stroll. And the stage directions note that she pauses to put a blanket on Harry, and it just seems like a really chill fall activity for someone whose life is in danger.
Yes. I feel like the point sort of narratively is it's for the people who are watching to amp up the tragedy of the fact that she's about to die by being oh, it's she has no idea. But it's she actually totally knew that her life was in danger. So
I guess since we're fan fictioning sexy, let's imagine a better scenario that would have amped up the feelings of the audience. Maybe Lily Potter pressed against the window, just gently stroking the glass, looking out at the busy people in the street.
Window. You're shipping Lily in the window.
People who are trapped on the other side of the window.
Lily trying desperately to turn boring household objects into toys for her child because she cannot go out and buy him anything.
Yeah. Here's a spatula. Harry. I almost said Elliot because I forgot what we were doing. Oops.
Anyway, okay, so speaking of narrative gaps, around the same part of the story, while they're all back in time in Godric's Hollow trying to figure out how to deal with Voldemort's imminent arrival, and Albus suggests that they will be able to find the ingredients to Polyjuice Potion and just brew it right up. Yeah. And everybody else, people take issue with that plan, but not for the obvious reason, which is, how long does it take to brew Polyjuice Potion?
At least a month.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really bad plan, and nobody there is sorry, no, that's not how that works.
Yeah. I don't know. It's really strange. Maybe the fact that no one thinks about the length of time it takes to brew is indicative of how stressed out they all are by the task at hand.
Good. Excellent reading.
Okay, super. Whew,
yeah.
Good. Glad we got through that one. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the last thing we wanted to talk about is how the whole of history rests on Neville Longbottom.
It sure does. I mean, that's the amazing thing, right? So you're in this dark timeline C, A, B, and C. And in timeline C, Harry is dead, But Harry's death is not what triggered it. What triggered it is Neville's death.
Yeah.
And arguably Cedric's lack of death.
Right.
So like Harry's death is an outcome of what happens to these other characters. But like that's so interesting for so many reasons, including what it suggests about how like, you know, Neville could have been the chosen one, but wasn't because of a decision Voldemort made. But this kind of implies that like in some way Neville still was.
Harry and Neville's value and their characters, I guess, just overlap in so many like fascinating ways. And even though Neville doesn't appear physically in the play, I think it's really fascinating that he still has such a significant and important contribution to the story overall. But I wonder why he wasn't in the play.
I know, it's very strange.
There are like ample opportunities to just have him going by, like, hey guys, dropping by Professor McGonagall's office.
Maybe he is. Maybe he's constantly just walking by in the background. He just doesn't have a speaking part.
He's just always holding a plant. Sexy.
Hey, Marcel, if you were going to ship two books together, which books would they be?
I'd probably ship like two very light paperback books together because the shipping charges would be a lot lower.
Boo! Let's delve deeper into the homoerotic undertones of print culture and materiality in Flourish and Blots.
Sexy. So.
Let's talk about theater.
All right. Okay, Hannah. So in the interview that you did with Jeremy Mason, we got to learn about what it is that plays do and why it is that some stories make really good plays, right? Theater has certain affordances, so you can tell a story in a specific way on the stage that you can't necessarily do through other mediums. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, what does the theater afford this story? Riddle me this.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's something about the like non-linearity of it and the way that it's sort of messing around with time, which is like, obviously those are things that you can do with narrative fiction and that people have done with narrative fiction. But that sort of like multiple retellings of the same storyline work in interesting ways when you get to see them reperformed again and again, where you can see a sort of reproduction of the same figures on the stage but in different relations to each other. Like, I think those kinds of stories are stories that are often told in theater or in film. Yeah, so I think there's something about that, like that desire to sort of play out a variety of hypothetical timelines that might work well as a performance, not specifically theater.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too when I was sort of flipping back through the various scenes, and I was thinking about how I wonder if one of the main benefits to telling the story as a play also has to do with like the way in which you can bring the audience into the experience in a slightly different way. So like a really good movie definitely has you like completely invested in what's happening on screen and you forget that you're sitting in an audience. But I was particularly taken with the way that it's described when the Dementors come after Hermione in Timeline C so this is after they've gotten back from aborting the mission to humiliate Cedric Diggory, and it's on page 191, and the stage directions say, "Suddenly from around the auditorium the feel of the breath of an icy wind. Some black robes arise around people, black robes that become black shapes, that become Dementors. So it seems like the plan here is to have the Dementors emerging from the entire theater and not just like from the sides of the stage. So like I feel like the way that the play is using the space of the theater is really interesting and really exciting in terms of bringing the audience into the action a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. There are moments when the description of how something is being imagined on stage, you know, a sort of shadow taking the form of Voldemort, or a moment where I wrote down like, poor sound guys, because this is just like an outrageous thing to write as a stage direction. But at one point it describes a sound. So it says Harry hears a noise, a hissing noise, and then there is a noise like death, a noise like nothing else we've heard before. I'm like, just imagine the sound guys getting that note. But there are so many moments like that just made me think like, God, I just want to see this performed. Like I want to see how you actually imagined this on stage. And that's something like you can create a sound that has a visceral impact on your audience, and you don't actually have to have words for it.
Right.
Because it's a performance. So like exactly some of the moments where I was like reading the stage directions and being like, this is absurd. Those are probably some of the moments that are the most interesting in performance.
So as much as we like ripped the stage directions a new one in the last episode, in this episode, we're like, yeah, this would be great. Love to see this performed.
I take it all back. I mean, it's interesting how like, because we're reading a remediation of the play, probably a lot of the things that make the least sense or seem the most weird in this reading are the things that are the most specific to the medium it's supposed to be. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, are the hardest to picture, or scenes that don't seem interesting on paper but would be really amazing performed because they're specific to a stage performance. So one of the other affordances that is specific to theater that doesn't really come across in our reading is cross-casting. It's quite common for plays to cast the same actors in multiple roles. Sometimes that is simply a function of like, you don't need to cast 5 people to play 5 different parts if those are all small parts and they're not on the stage at the same time. Right. You can just, you know, if you're in the chorus of a big production, you might end up playing a ton of different roles. But often that is used deliberately to draw connections between different characters and sort of thematic resonances. So the example that always pops to mind for me is Angels in America. It's very sort of deliberately done, and you need to know who the cross-casting is to actually understand the story. And it is also a prominent feature in Hamilton, the musical.
Ooh.
So there you go.
Yeah, it is also historically part of Shakespearean theater. On Shakespeare's stage, it was like a necessity. The same actor who plays Cordelia in King Lear also plays Lear's fool. And there's...
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
and
that's super interesting.
A moment at the end. So like one of the problems with King Lear is what happens to the fool, because the fool just kind of disappears at some point. And then when Lear is holding Cordelia's body, I think this is when it happens, he says something like, "And my poor fool is dead." So the fact that the same actor plays both the fool and Cordelia makes that
resonate in different ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like, is Lear talking about his dead daughter who is the fool, or is he talking about his like literal fool who is gone?
That's interesting. Yeah. There's another, as we framed it, sort of theater specific affordance, right? That you really can't produce an effect like that in prose.
No,
that's just not how it works.
Nor in film, not really. Not in the same way. Anyway, that's really interesting. If only Neil were here, we could ask him why it is that you can't do that in cinema in the same way.
Hey, Neil.
Oh.
So let's talk about the doubled up casting in this play.
Yeah.
Let's talk about who's crosscast.
Did any of them stand out to you in particular?
I mean, they're fascinating across the board. Amos Diggory and Albus Dumbledore. Legitimating versus delegitimating the choices that Harry made.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it sort of sets them up as these pairs of, like, so on the one hand, you've got Amos telling Harry that, like, he made the wrong decisions and unnecessarily sacrificed people along the way. And then you have Dumbledore sort of saying, like, it only could have played out the way that it did. And it ends up being Harry questioning Dumbledore's claim that things had to be the way that they were.
I'm really interested in the fact that the Trolley Witch and Professor McGonagall are played by the same actor, because the implication in that for me is that Hogwarts doesn't start at Hogwarts, that the institution begins at platform 9 3/4. And the rage that Professor McGonagall expresses about Albus and Scorpius leaving the train and stuff, the fact that that's sort of like a natural carryover from the rage of the Trolley Witch who failed to keep them on there in the first place.
Oh, that's interesting. What about Moaning Myrtle and Lily Potter?
So I would have been more interested if the actor who played Lily Potter Sr. also played Ginny.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the more obvious parallel.
What strikes you about that, Moaning Myrtle and Lily?
Like some humanizing, like part of the humanizing of Moaning Myrtle, right? Like she's played so much for humor in the movies, and in the books she's so much just a silly character. And what's done with her in the play, like at the textual level, is like giving her a full name, trying to give her a history, trying to take her a little bit more seriously. And I think sort of casting her as the same actor who's playing, you know, this very serious, very beloved and central character sort of reinforces that. Like, here is somebody who is like an actual person.
Yeah, definitely.
We should maybe stop treating so poorly.
So I'm also interested in Uncle Vernon, Severus Snape, and Lord Voldemort all being played by the same actor. I think that that's really interesting. And similarly, Aunt Petunia, Madame Hooch, and Dolores Umbridge. I kind of want to put Madame Hooch in brackets because I don't have any particular feelings about that teacher.
But they're very similar trios, right? Like the aunt and uncle, a teacher, a villain. Like each of them plays those three sets.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting, huh?
Yeah, I mean, again, when you think about the way that like a reproduction of the same person on stage suggests these sorts of resonances between these different figures, it draws these sort of links between like your life at home, your life at school, the larger political stakes of this world. And it takes those things that like the books have been working really hard to tie together, and it ties them together visually by making them actually the same person. Let's talk about one last instance of cross-casting, which is the cross-casting of Hagrid and the Sorting Hat.
So that's not a cross-casting that would have occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, I see them both as these figures that are sort of like institutions of Hogwarts, that are sort of established with like the comforting, familiar aspects of Hogwarts. You know, that are always there, that help make it orderly, that make it make sense as a space, especially because Hagrid is the one who brings Harry into the wizarding world and gives him his place there. And then the Sorting Hat is the thing that literally gives you your place in the wizarding world. And so they both seem to me to sort of represent the institution itself, and like what it means to find your place, which is interesting within the play as a whole, because a lot of this play is about resisting the assumption that everybody has the same experience at Hogwarts as Harry does, that everybody finds their place as easily as Harry does, right? So the Sorting Hat is no longer the one that like comfortably places you where you belong, but it becomes this source right from the beginning, this source of tension for somebody like Albus who really doesn't know where he belongs. You know, and it's interesting that Albus doesn't seem to have a relationship with Hagrid.
Yeah.
And that Hagrid, you know, mostly shows up in the flashbacks. Yeah, so cross-casting. I would be super interested if for anybody who has seen the play, if you wanted to to holler at us and tell us about, for example, whether the cross-casting is at all visually apparent.
Yeah.
Like, can you tell that some of these actors are the same person? Does it sort of strike you when you're watching it? Or is there an effort made to cover that up and it feels more like it was just a sort of like, we have all these actors, let's use them more than once?
See, I'm pretty sure the point of fan fiction is to explore alternative possibilities for actual real characters in your fandom and thus challenge the hegemony of one particular narrative perspective. Not like make your stapler and mug pretend to kiss.
Sexy.
Still confused? Let's untangle the complexities of shifting narratives in The Boy Who Narrated.
Yay, we have so much to talk about in this segment. So I'm going to jump right in with something I remember. It's a conversation I remember hearing on some kind of podcast.
Okay.
And it was about the new Star Wars movies. Mm-hmm. And the fact that when the Star Wars extended universe novels sort of came in, a thing that they did was expand the universe outwards.
Okay.
And with the new movies that are being made now, all of those extended universe novels were declared non-canon, and the movies are now the canon. And what the movies do is fixate on that original trio. They continue to center around Luke and Leia and Han and like their children and nieces and nephews and backstories. And it becomes sort of this question, or, whatever podcast this was I was listening to asked was like, why do these new sort of expanded universe stories still so much want to fixate on the same characters rather than actually expanding and giving us this new perspective? And it suggested that there's something conservative about it. It's a sort of conservative logic of like modern movie making, which is like, in order to make sure that we get enough interested viewers, we need to stick with the same characters. And that really that's what struck me about Cursed Child as a sort of sequel narrative, is that it has the similar conservative logic of, let's not actually take Albus and Scorpius outside of the original 7 books and give them a new story and add something new to the wizarding world. It's like, let's use the two of them as a device to obsessively circle back on the narrative of our original 3, on teasing out more about that story, a sort of, this sort of obsessive spooling around the same plot points that makes this feel more like an extended epilogue than an actual new entry in this world.
Yeah.
That's what struck me about the narrative structure of this play and about the sort of time travel device. What a lot of readers have said feels fan fiction-y to them feels more to me like the kind of thing the Star Wars movies are doing, right? It feels more to me like this kind of conservative desire to stay focused on the same characters and keep retelling the same story and fleshing out more details of the same story than expanding outwards. And I'm not sure if it's sort of a chicken and the egg thing, like maybe narratives are doing that because that's what fan fiction does, and so that's how you provide fan service and that's how you tell stories you're sure people will like. Or maybe that's a misrepresentation of fan fiction, and fan fiction actually does a better job of expanding outwards and telling new stories.
That's really interesting. Especially considering the Harry Potter extended universe that's being made into films right now, and Pottermore and all of that stuff, that like in the face of those things happening, we get this play that is released in book form for readers that does obsessively focus on that trio. So part of me wonders if maybe the timing is deliberate, in that this book that does so obsessively focus on our original trio kind of mitigates any sense of disappointment in extended universe apparatuses, I'll just say, that don't have anything to do with that original trio.
Is it exciting to have more Wizarding World stuff being produced that has nothing to do with Harry, or is that disappointing for people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, I would be interested in hearing from people, like, when you think about Rowling producing sort of sanctioned new material set in this world, are you excited at the idea of it sort of leaving Harry behind entirely and just going off in different directions? Or is that like, do you sort of lose interest? Are you like, well, I'm not in it for your world. I'm in it for these characters who I'm emotionally invested in.
Yeah. I wonder if a useful comparison might be the way that in Doctor Who, when there's a new Doctor, it's like a really common thing for fans of the previous Doctor to go through a real process of grieving, right? Because like your Doctor is gone, and now there's a new Doctor with whole new adventures and new interests and new companions and new whatever. And like all of those things that you loved about the previous Doctor, those are just left behind.
Yeah, I mean, it's a risky thing built right into the fandom of Doctor Who, which is part of what makes it so interesting. And no, we are not going to start a Doctor Who podcast.
Oh no, there are plenty of Doctor Who podcasts. You don't need us.
It's taken care of. Just go listen to Verity. It's good. It's fine. I mean, I'm interested in the way that people are talking about the Cursed Child as being resonant with fan fiction, but I'm also interested in other ways we can read what's happening narratively. So let's talk more about how the narrative of this play, through its production of multiple alternate timelines, sort of introduces some interesting, exciting new narrative devices. You know, it's doing this thing where it's teaching us more about the original books, about our original characters, and about our new characters within the play itself, by moving them through different timelines and seeing the way that they play out in different ways. And we're going to talk about some of those in more detail in some later segments, but there is this really interesting way that you get to see the same characters in totally different contexts. Yeah, I think the best example is Scorpius in Timeline C, realizing that in a world in which Voldemort comes to power, he's a bad guy.
Okay, so Scorpius turns up in Timeline C and discovers that he's like a princeling of dark magic. Everybody, he's like really good at sports. I did love that moment when Dolores Umbridge is like going through all the things that he's really good at, and he's like, sports?
Really? Sports? But it's like, who knows how many of us would secretly be good at sports if we were adequately pressured into attempting them. I mean, not me, but...
Certainly not me.
No.
I'm really interested in what this play is suggesting about the way in which we become who we are. Because if someone as pure a soul as Scorpius can, in another timeline, be a violent, like racist abuser, that suggests to me that this has everything to do with nurture and not just like with what your biology is. It's like we've talked a lot in the past about the way that the original series and the way that this play too kind of hinges on the idea of biology as a predeterminant for who you're going to become.
Yeah.
And I feel like this moment where Scorpius visits Timeline C and sees what he could have become really kind of throws that out the window.
Yeah. It's very much a nurture, not nature. Like, who Scorpius is entirely different depending on the world that he exists in. And given a world in which he sort of enters Hogwarts with a set of assumptions already made about him, which is that he will be powerful, he will, he will ascend to a position of power naturally. That is the position his father shares, that he will be good at everything because that's the nature of power. That's who he becomes. I mean, it reminds me, I'm sure I've brought this up before, but I had a professor in my undergrad who, during a class in which we were discussing the nature of evil in the context of Nazism, suggested that there are just some people who have the capacity for evil, and that it is the job of civil society to keep those people from having access to those forms of evil. And we were having this debate that, like, what does the rise of Nazism prove? Does it prove that evil is banal, which is to say that most people don't think critically about the ethical repercussions of what they're doing, that they just do what everybody else is doing no matter what. That's the argument that I very much believe.
Yeah.
Or his perspective, which is that some people are good and some people are evil.
Right.
And that good people will always be good, but that evil people need to be controlled.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that's a ridiculous idea. Maybe he just doesn't understand how ideology functions and how what constitutes evil is socially determined.
Yeah, I know. To go back to that former sort of the thing that I believe, the thing that we have discussed, which is that evil is not a sort of inherent property of an individual. Voldemort's not fundamentally evil. Voldemort is a product of the society that he grows up in. And I think that thesis that we presented in our reading of the books gets reinforced in this play.
Yeah, we're very good readers.
We're so good at reading. It shows us that our beloved Scorpius, who is so sweet and kind, if positioned in a particular way in relation to power, if told by everybody, this is how you're going to behave, that's how he behaves.
Yeah.
So like what's interesting then is to see him return to his own timeline with the knowledge of what he might be, and to think about how that's then going to inform what he thinks of himself as a person. And if there's comparable ways that we can think about our own natures as products of a particular set of circumstances rather than something that is innate to us. You know, how would I be different in a different set of circumstances, and how might that induce me to sort of like pause in my assumptions about who I am as a person?
I know for me, I don't actually have to do a whole lot of imagining because I was a very different person before I encountered radical feminism and saw the light. And if I hadn't had the educational opportunities, and by that I don't mean classrooms, I mean like the just like the friends and the peers and the workshops that I attended and stuff, if I hadn't had those experiences, I wouldn't be the person who I am today. I'd be like Timeline A Marcel, and Timeline A Marcel is fundamentally less charitable and generous and a terrible ally than Timeline B Marcel, which is me right now. I guess just in like further evidence of Scorpius being the best, what I find so lovely about Scorpius's experience seeing who he could have been is how he sees that world. So like he sees Timeline C and recognizes that like he's got so much more privilege and he's so much more powerful, and he's confident and he's popular, but he recognizes that the world isn't better.
When he sees that, it's horrifying. It's not exciting for him. It's not like, oh, look, like I'm in a position of power. It's like, dear God, what is this thing that I have in me?
Yeah. And what he brings back to Timeline A is not uber confidence, although he is a little bit more confident, but it's that he describes himself as being Malfoy the unanxious, which I think is amazing. So it's like the things that make him so endearing to us as readers remain consistent.
Yeah.
He doesn't allow confidence to stop him from being compassionate. Instead, he just gets a little bit less anxious.
Yeah, he's like, I have this capacity to be a brave person. What does he learn from that experience is like, it's like, oh, also, I'm not inevitably the way that I am. Like, you know, and that might play out in one direction as a like, if given the right set of circumstances, you become a monster. But also like, oh, cool, I actually have the capacity for confidence in me. Yeah, just like non-inevitability is really interesting as one of the implications of time travel in this narrative, which is particularly fascinating when you set it against the things that are framed as inevitable. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so let's put a pin in this for a second so that you can complain about the logic of time travel some more.
Okay, so this didn't occur to me when we were talking about time travel last time, but all of a sudden what I'm really wrestling with this idea, again, this comes back to me just like not being able to cope with there being multiple timelines. That's just not a thing that I can wrap my head around. So Scorpius, his physical body moves from one timeline into another. So timeline C Scorpius is a real human creature, but then isn't there anymore. And is replaced by this Scorpius. So here's why this confuses me so much, okay?
Because time travel is not real.
I know, mostly because time travel is not real. But here's what super confuses me. It presupposes that Scorpius's conception, gestation, and birth were all 100% in sync with Scorpius timeline A's conception, gestation, and birth. Because otherwise, how can the one replace the other?
Yeah.
They're different. Like, they just are different.
Yeah, I mean, the assumption that, like, in this completely different universe, the same person would still exist at all is silly, right?
Yeah.
That, like, he would have been born at the same time and have the same name and look the same. Like, that's all actually quite absurd, but that's just a narrative conceit.
Yeah.
The implications of Scorpius turning up in this timeline and replacing other Scorpius is also goes back to your original understanding of time travel, which is like the timelines match back up. So it's not that he's multiplied into multiple selves. It's like there's only one of him in each timeline. So if he enters his own timeline, he replaces himself, which is like also not how time travel works in The Prisoner of Azkaban, because when Harry and Hermione go back,
right,
they see the other themselves. So like, where is timeline C Scorpius? Yeah,
he's like out.
He's
like
out
making out with somebody.
Yeah.
Sexy.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some other aspects of how this whole time travel multiplying worlds thing is represented. Let's talk about prophecy.
Okay, so much like the way prophecy functions in the original series, we come to learn that a prophecy does not in and of itself do anything. When you make a prophecy, it's just words. What turns prophecy into a thing is when
people hearing the prophecy and doing it.
Yeah. And so Delphi has a prophecy told to her by Mr. Bellatrix Lestrange, and he's not a soothsayer or an augury or a Sybil Trelawney. So like, is it a real prophecy, or did he just like tell her? Who even knows? I don't know. But it was revealed to her, and then it ends up she's not able to fulfill it despite her best attempts, and so then tries to go about her project, which is to save her father's life through other means. So like, prophecy doesn't mean anything.
Prophecy means nothing. And in fact, the revelation for her that prophecies do not have to turn out the way that they did is then the thing that allows her to go back and attempt to have things not turn out the way that they did, because she realizes that they're not inevitable, which then has the crux of the narrative turn on this perverse attempt to maintain a set of events that were profoundly non-inevitable, that they now have to work really hard to keep the same, which is to say Voldemort killing Lily and James because he thought he had to. What unfolded afterwards was a result of that set of events, and so now they need to force them to happen. So like, prophecy is like profoundly meaninless, but ends up sort of it turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what it does. That's what it does. So I guess prophecy is ideology.
It sounds like it.
Prophecy is like a way of framing the world as inevitable when it was in fact entirely
evitable.
Could have turned out anyway. But once you have framed it as inevitably that way and people believe it to be true, it becomes true, not because it was inevitable, but because people believed it. Oh,
I know.
Oh,
yeah.
But
ideology.
I mean, that ending, there are sillinesses in the narrative structure of this story, but that ending in which Harry and everybody he cares about have to stand by and bear witness to his parents' death because that's the only way that they know how to make the world that they live in have happened is so sad.
Yeah.
So this is the last thing I want to talk about in this section, which is this idea of bearing witness. The idea that there are some situations in the world that you cannot alter through force of will, that you can't sort of make better through heroic action, and that the best thing that you can do is just stand by and bear witness to it. Like, I find that ethically interesting. I think that there's a real temptation that if we know that we can't do anything about a bad situation, then we don't want to see it. And we don't want to think about it. We'd rather turn a blind eye to things that we can't change because it feels too hard to look at things that are really ugly and not be able to do anything about it. Like, we want to be able to fix things. We want that fantasy of power. And some things you cannot fix. And so there is this sort of ethics at work in like looking at what you cannot fix and just seeing it. And recognizing that it's, you know, it is painful and it is terrible, but like sometimes life is painful and terrible and you have to just look at that. And in fact, that sort of becomes the necessary thing that Harry had to do to reunite himself with his son. You know, he's been trying too hard to sort of hide his son from the ugliness of the world and to sort of frame his heroism as being about agency. And that's what alienates Albus, and what eventually sort of brings them back together is the pain of what neither of them could do anything to change.
Yeah.
Oh, what a sad story.
This
book is very sad.
I think part of what is also really interesting about this in relation to time travel is that in some ways we can also think of this as functioning as a kind of metaphor for what we do with our past traumas, right? You can't change the things that you have experienced in your past. All you can really do is bear witness to those things.
Yeah.
And what this play seems to suggest is that you get through those by having a community of people who love and trust and support you, and who you can then love and trust and support in turn.
Yeah. In some ways, this is a story about trauma and about the sort of long history of trauma. You know, Voldemort's not coming back. Harry just hasn't been able to work through what, you know, that set of experience has done to him. He says at the end that, you know, Voldemort might be out of his life, but he had yet to get him successfully out of his head.
Yeah.
And that the thing that helps him work through that is reliving that like originary traumatic moment with his entire community around him to help him, right? And he says, you know, there's that line where Delphi says to him, like, you're not strong enough to fight me by yourself. And he's like, yeah, no, I know I'm not, but I never fight by myself.
Yeah.
Right? And like that final fight is not actually the climax. The climax is the non-fight of watching his parents die and what it means to have his community there to make that possible for him to sort of work through it. And the way that sort of collectively working through that moment of trauma becomes an opportunity for that community to become closer to each other. It's a really lovely story about ways that we can collectively work through trauma. Okay, I think I'm starting to get a handle on this. It doesn't need to be about creating sexy, unexpected pairings.
Sexy.
Fanfic can just be an opportunity to explore underwritten characters. Like, I could write a whole novel about Snape pursuing a Master's of Education and returning to Hogwarts with a strong sense of student-based learning outcomes.
Sexy.
You know, come to think of it, that might be a bit of a stretch. Okay, let's talk about this for the rest of the episode. In potions class. Can we talk about Snape first?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Nothing that has happened before, no number of Snape defendants amongst our listener base, no amount of Alan Rickman's performance has redeemed Snape to me as wholly as like the 5 pages he had in this play.
Tell me about that.
It just totally changed my perspective on him. Snape, under Dumbledore's reign, so to speak, has a vested interest in pretending to be on Dumbledore's side.
Mm-hmm.
Both because it provides him with sort of safety within the status quo, and then Snape as a double agent has personal selfish motivations to continue to sort of do what he thinks Lily would have wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it was selfless, it never felt politically motivated to me.
Right.
And I really, really appreciate this play textualizes exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it acknowledges that he started with these really selfish motives, right?
Mm-hmm.
He says on page 193, I couldn't save Harry for Lily, so now I give my allegiance to the cause she believed in, and it's possible that along the way I started believing in it myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difference that I really struggled with, is like Snape as somebody who actually believes in this cause, which is like anti-fascist,
Mm-hmm.
versus Snape as somebody who's like going through the motions for the sake of this love. And Snape, like 20 years later, which is where we're seeing him now,
Mm-hmm.
as a much older man who has continued to live under Voldemort's reign, to work at Hogwarts, but now that there's really nothing in it for him, has continued to commit himself to this cause, has continued to hold these things close to him, and who, given a renewed set of circumstances, remains the kind of person who would sacrifice himself.
Mm-hmm.
Because he does have this sense of what is right, and a sense that has become more so the longer he has lived with it.
Right. Yeah.
I found that a convincing version of him.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a like he was a noble hero the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just that his attachment to Lily provides him with a starting point for being resistant to what's going on around him.
Mm-hmm.
The Snape that I saw in this play was somebody who is no longer doing it for those selfish reasons,
Mm-hmm.
but who continues to be that same kind of person, right? Like somebody who would give himself for this cause.
And he continues to do that without being under Dumbledore's thumb. Like he's no longer anybody's lackey. He's very clearly and genuinely invested in this cause.
Yeah, I don't know. I really, like, this play really did something for me in terms of this character.
I guess when I read this play and saw Snape sacrificing himself so heroically in this way, all I could really think about were all of the people who finally got to see Snape play the hero and not just hear about him being the hero secondhand.
Yeah.
I thought that was special.
Speaking of revisiting familiar teachers, I would like to chat a little bit about the revisiting with Dumbledore.
Sure.
The scene in which Harry has a conversation with Dumbledore through the painting. So there's this sort of interesting through line in this play about shitty parenting and what it does to you.
Mm-hmm.
And how much shitty parenting both our heroes and our villains have received.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, Delphi's tragedy is deliberately held up against Harry's.
Mm-hmm.
They were both orphans.
Mm-hmm.
They were both incredibly lonely. And Delphi thinks that she can change that by finding her father, that she won't have that intense experience of loneliness, which is why in that scene when Harry says to her, he says, you can't remake your life. You'll always be an orphan that never leaves you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which is this really profound statement on Harry's part for how deeply after everything he still has that experience of loss as his origin story.
Mm-hmm.
And the end of the play does show us that that's the way that it has to be, but it also shows us what parts of that were not inevitable in that scene where Harry confronts Dumbledore and says, you actually didn't have to treat me the way that you did. You actually could have been a better father to me.
Mm-hmm.
And the confrontation, Dumbledore sort of stumbling to justify himself, and then Harry saying, you would have hurt me less if you had told me this then. despite all of the tragedy and inevitability that surrounded us, you could have just like verbalized your love for me and that would have changed a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a really profound sort of counter to the aspects of the story that emphasize what's inevitable. So like some of these losses are just losses that you can't change, but like, hey, look, here's a thing that you can change. You just like tell the people in your life that you love them.
Yeah.
All of these children just desperately need somebody to be kind to them.
Yeah. And if we look at the two Draco Malfoys, we see Draco Malfoy in timeline C, where presumably his parents never had to like reckon with the possibility that they were going to lose him. Right? Like we don't exactly know how the Wizarding Wars would have played out differently, but we know that they did differently.
Yeah.
And so that timeline C Draco, he turns into his father, essentially, and he treats Scorpius very much in the same way that Lucius treated him. Essentially, what that's saying to us is that without parents reaching out to their kids, without parents like showing their children that they love them and not just like that they want the best for them, whatever that means in any particular circumstance, that like you like that's what turns your children into monsters.
Let's all just start using the cursed child as a parenting manual.
Yeah. Or like what not to do.
What not to do, how not to parent. Not sure how to do it right, but don't do any of these things.
Yeah. Probably the best thing about fan fiction is the way it lets you push back against the default assumptions of whiteness, heterosexuality, and other kinds of normativity that are actually super duper oppressive.
Sexy.
So let's take a walk outside Hegemony in the Forbidden Forest.
I was trying to figure out a way to build a joke in there about how this play really shows us how radical fan fiction can be by continuing to recenter two white men.
Okay, so this is another section where we have like a number of things that we want to go through. So let's start with Voldemort being a father.
Yeah. So we got a ton of questions about this in the WP Curious Child hashtag. This is the thing that I think people have expressed the most doubt about. It seems so unlikely to people that Voldemort would have had a child. And so there's two ways that people have expressed that doubt. One way is just at the sort of narrative / character level. So Voldemort is obsessed with immortality. Why would he have a child if he believes he is going to live forever? So let's deal with that first. Does that seem unlikely to you? That this evil figure who is obsessed with making himself immortal would somehow impregnate one of his followers?
It does seem very unlikely to me. Reproduction does not seem in keeping with Voldemort's character to me for like a host of reasons, but not least of which is the fact that Voldemort has never expressed any interest in offspring of any kind. And his lack of interest in relating to others suggests to me a lack of interest in having others like him. And one of the things that people say about having children is that you like want to bring more people into the world like you. And Voldemort, he's a lone wolf.
You know, he's not trying to reproduce himself via a right-hand man or like a lieutenant kind of figure who he actually tries to sort of crush down everybody around him.
Yeah.
Even that image of him, you know, in timeline C having the augury as his sort of right-hand man seems a little unlikely. Because would he share power in that way?
Absolutely. Like that seems equally incredible to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have any particular reason to actually believe that Delphine is his child?
I don't think so. I see no reliable textual evidence to this effect. And similarly, zero believable textual evidence that Delphi is even the daughter of Bellatrix.
Yeah, there's no reason to believe any of it. All you know is that this is what she was told. And then that goes back to that, like the way that prophecy produces itself, that somebody told her, this is who you are, this is what you're meant to do. And she buys it and she structures her entire life around it.
Yeah.
But there's no reason to assume that that is actually the case.
In fact, we don't even know that Delphi was ever told this that's just what she's telling us and the other characters, right? She, like, this is the backstory that she provides, but we have no reason to even believe her. We know she's a liar, so why would we believe her about this?
I mean, she's clearly unhinged. So this could just be, you know, she was a sad, lonely orphan. And this is a story that she told herself, that she was the heir to Voldemort.
Yeah.
You know, when Andrea and I were talking about who's the next Voldemort and the sort of inevitability of there being a next Voldemort, we were talking in particular about how aspects of the world that produced the first Voldemort have not changed. And that's exactly the context in which Delphi was produced as the next one, which is that the wizarding world continued to be set up around these structures of like who's in and who's out, who's welcomed and who's not welcomed. And she felt lonely and estranged from everybody around her. This play tells us very clearly that isolation produces certain kinds of personality. Voldemort was lonely and isolated. Draco was lonely and isolated. He reproduced for himself a son that was lonely and isolated. Like, that's what, again, nurture, not nature.
Yeah.
Like, Delphi was turned into another Voldemort through what happened to her as a child. So there's one piece of it. There's sort of one half of the answer to the, like, you know, Delphi is Voldemort's child, is that we have no particular reason at any level to believe it.
Right.
But the other piece is the way that I saw a lot of people talking about this idea about not really buying Voldemort having a child was in this, like, it's so icky to imagine Voldemort having sex, or, you know, LOL, does he even have a penis? This kind of like shaming of Voldemort that I found very, very strange and honestly kind of distasteful. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on you guys, because I know that we all fall into these things all the time, you know, fall into this language and into these tropes, and that we came very close to some similar ways of talking about Voldemort when we were talking about him as an effeminate or asexual villain, that, you know, it is hard to imagine Voldemort having sex. That is true about the way that he is produced for us textually as a villain. But that then slides so easily into a, like, he's not manly enough to have a child, into this sort of disgust with the idea of him biologically reproducing, as though biological reproduction is synonymous with sexual desire, with virility, as though the only sort of male sexed people who could biologically reproduce are those whose gender performance conforms to expectations of masculinity. Which is to say that Voldemort does not present as masculine in a way that is at all recognizable to people, and therefore he can't have biologically reproduced.
Right.
And that's not how that works.
Yeah. And I think, too, in what you're describing, there's also a sense of, like, conflating biological reproduction with being normal.
Yeah.
And because Voldemort is not normal and does not operate through normative sexuality, he can't reproduce. And it's icky to think about him reproducing, because we associate very specific heteronormative sexual practices with reproduction, and anything that falls outside of that is weird or threatening or unbelievable in a whole host of ways.
Yeah, so Voldemort's, like, part of the way he's cast as a villain is through this sort of the vilification of asexuality, the vilification of the eunuch figure, you know, which we've talked through, and we've talked through it particularly on Twitter with our listeners, who have pointed out how the asexual figure and the eunuch figure often reappear as villains because of how a failure to perform traditional forms of heterosexuality is conflated with villainy in our oppressively heteronormative patriarchal world. But this sort of, to then take that and say, like, it's laughable to think of Voldemort having a child, actually reproduces the same set of tropes that resulted in Voldemort being represented the way he is in the first place.
Yes.
We need to take this particular kind of step back and be like, when I doubt that Voldemort could have a child, how am I taking for granted the oppressive stereotypes that are being used to depict Voldemort as a villain in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Funny how things come full circle like that, huh?
Man, they sure do. So there you go. So I don't think it makes narrative sense to picture Voldemort wanting to have a kid. I agree with that critique. I don't think narratively we need to assume that it's true that Voldemort had a child. And 3, I think that we need to be cautious about how we express our doubt about Voldemort having a child in the first place. So it's a tricky little tangle of a narrative situation that this play has created.
Yes. Okay. So while we are talking about normativity and the heteropatriarchal structures in which we operate, why don't we also talk about the default of whiteness?
Yeah, let's talk about that thing.
So our mutual friend, Chris Chang-in Phillips, texted me one day to say, hey, did you know that the actor who plays the Sorting Hat and Hagrid is also Black? And there was no international outcry about that. And I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
So I think it is extremely exciting that the actor who plays a man who is part giant is Black, because I think that so much in our fantasy literature and in our fantasy films and now also fantasy plays, whenever we have a fantastic character, they default to white unless their racial or ethnic makeup is in some way part of their fantasticalness, right?
Yeah.
So with the goblins, their Semiticness is part of what makes them goblins. And with the centaurs in the film, the indigenous tropes that they use to create the centaurs are used to like represent their naturalness and their like wildness and non-civilizedness, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like in the fucking Lord of the Rings movies, the elves are like the whitest thing you've ever seen, right?
So white. And the racialized characters are monstrous.
Exactly. Like we at this time live in a world that is so steeped in white supremacy that even in our fantastic creatures, the default is white. It is impossible to imagine, and it's obviously not impossible. Huge scare quotes around impossible. It's impossible to imagine like racially diverse elves.
We come back to this whenever we do Jew Watch. So there you go. Jew Watch.
There's some goblins referenced in this part of the play.
Yeah. But like the larger point that we're making there is the way that fantasy tropes are steeped in white supremacy and then get depoliticized by fans of fantasy who just say like, oh, well, this is just a fantasy trope, as though those things emerged out of thin air and didn't emerge out of a world. Claire and I were talking about this yesterday, about the way that people defend fantasy worlds by saying, well, that's just how it is, as though that world wasn't invented by somebody who could have invented it differently.
Yeah. Okay, so to get sort of back to talking about Hagrid, I guess the reason why I was so tickled to discover that Chris Jarman plays Hagrid is because he happens to be part giant and his blackness is not the motivator behind that, right? It is that he is a partially fantastical figure who happens to be Black. And I feel like that is something that we are in desperate need of. And it would be so great if more mainstream fantasy writers could start doing that.
Yes. Hardcore yes.
Oh,
yes.
But also, while we're on this topic, maybe we should have a conversation about why it is that Hagrid being played by a Black actor wouldn't cause an international outcry in the way that Hermione, played by a Black actress, does. I think part of it is the fact that if Hermione is Black, then Ron and Hermione have an interracial relationship that is very threatening to a lot of white people.
Yeah. I mean, Hagrid's not one of our main characters in the same way. Part of it, I think, is just like a protagonist issue. And I think what happened for a lot of white readers, you know, when they found out Hermione was being cast as Black, was like, how dare you? I defaulted to assuming that she was the same as me because that's a privilege I always have. And you're taking that away from me. Whereas I'm sure far fewer readers imaginatively place himself in the position of Hagrid.
Yeah.
The old relatability trap.
Yeah. So I don't actually know what the ethnographic makeup of the angry racists is, but I'm curious whether a lot of them were angry white young women who really identified with Hermione because of the lack of substantial female characters in mainstream narratives, maybe.
Yeah.
Not an excuse, ladies.
No. And of course, let's not forget the absolutely number one most important thing about fan fiction. The triumphant recentering of Hermione Granger as the true hero of the Harry Potter stories.
Sexy.
Granger danger! So let's talk about Timeline C Hermione.
Timeline C Hermione is obviously the best.
Yeah. So like we talked about Hermione as spinster and our issues with Hermione as spinster in the last episode. But this one really counters that. It shows us that like a childless, unmarried Hermione is not inevitably a spinster. She was just a spinster in this one particular set of circumstances because in Timeline C, she is a revolutionary. And the stage directions make it very clear to us that like
She looks good.
Hermione thrives as a revolutionary. Perhaps more so than any of the other identities we've seen her in. Which is fascinating to think that like if there is a calling that she had, it was to be a warrior.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what else that suggests is that the thing that is the most toxic to like Hermione as a powerful figure is just like banal heteronormativity.
Yeah, that like what makes her bitter in Timeline B is not having an unfulfilling life, but being unmarried and childless in this really boring world where that's the expectation and that's the status quo.
Yeah.
She's unfulfilled because she has no venue for her own remarkableness.
Exactly.
You know, in Timeline A, she's running things. And in Timeline C, she's in this position of like constantly having to sort of work against the status quo. And both of those give her adequate outlet for just like her sheer quantity of brilliance.
Maybe the heteropatriarchy should be crushed.
Sexy.
Maybe we would all be happier. Even if it's crushed by totalitarianism, we'd still be happier.
Let's talk about the degree to which totalitarianism does or does not crush the heteropatriarchy in Timeline C.
Okay.
Because Hermione and Ron are still in love.
I mean, you can't help who you love, Hannah. Okay, so Hermione and Ron are still in love, but they don't bother with normative expressions of romance. I guess what thrills me about this timeline so much, or about my ability to read this as being outside the boundaries of normative heteropatriarchal relationship structures, is that Hermione and Ron still love each other deeply and are still able to like take care of each other and thrive together and live and work together, but in a way that is so completely opposite to how we understand relationships to function under a system of heteronormative patriarchy.
Yeah. It might be a revelation to Ron that Hermione loves him, because when she says that she loves him and has always loved him, he's surprised. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that that intimacy remained, that they, you know, they continued to work together. They continued to be close partners through this entire business when there was no time or space for traditional forms of relationships.
And I mean, like, there might have been some time.
Yeah. I really like how between the three timelines, Hermione is the one who gets the most variety. Like, Ron is pretty Ron-ish from timeline to timeline. He's like a little more beaten down in one than the other, a little more conservative. And Harry's just alive or not.
Yeah.
But like Hermione becomes these radically different people from timeline to timeline. And that's so interesting to me because it suggests so much more potential in her as a person. That she has so many completely different things that she could turn out to be. You know, she's not stuck on this one very particular path.
Hermione is, as Minister of Magic, like, Hermione loves like rules and organization, and I'm sure she's very happy in that role. But I bet that role is a lot less fulfilling than being a revolutionary.
I bet. Did her portrayal in this play shift anything? Any of your thoughts about her? Any of your impressions of her as a character?
No. Should it have? Did
No.
it for you?
No,
Okay.
it felt very, very in key. I'm trying to think of like there are characters who my perception of them was changed through watching how they played out. Snape is one, Draco is one, you know, that I sort of learned new things about them and they became complicated in really productive ways for me. And it's interesting how like watching Hermione through all these different timelines, I still felt like, yes, this is the Hermione that I know and love.
Oh.
You know, when it comes down to it, fan fiction is all about wresting narrative control out of the hands of the author and putting it back where it belongs, with the readers.
Sexy.
In that spirit, let's let our listeners take the reins and answer some of their pressing questions in Final Revisions.
So we're plumbing a bit more from the WP Curious Child hashtag that we put out and answering a few more questions that people had. And we're going to start with, what do you think about Cedric turning out to be a Death Eater?
Yeah, I really struggle with this one because I think if anything in this play is going to feel fan fiction-y to me, it's going to be Cedric turning into a Death Eater because it feels so out of the character that I know from the original series. That one feels so much like a reimagining.
Actually feels kind of like a betrayal to me.
It does, yeah, to me too. And I've been really working with this idea and trying to make it make sense. And the only thing that I can come up with is the notion of toxic masculinity, which is a thing that is real and it is a thing that is present in the original series, but that Cedric never expressed because he was always so handsome and popular and never needed to fall back on toxic masculinity tropes, right? And so it only becomes believable to me that he could become a Death Eater if people turned on him and ridiculed him for his poor performance, in which case it's not humiliation that makes Cedric into a Death Eater. It's a culture of toxic masculinity where popular men, especially men who are like beloved and successful, all of a sudden lose the foundation of those privileges and end up being taken down a few notches so that they're just as weak as everybody else.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It then makes it really interesting that humiliation is the strategy that Albus and Scorpius choose, because it suggests that they like recognize that like that's the worst thing that can happen in the context of toxic masculinity, is like the worst thing that can happen to you is to be humiliated, because you can rest assured that everybody will respond in a particular way to your emasculation.
Yeah, it's like that Margaret Atwood quote that men are afraid women will make fun of them and women are afraid men will kill them.
Oh God, the patriarchy is so broken.
Ugh. Yeah. Masculinity is a trap.
So, speaking of masculinity being a trap, let's talk about a narrative trap that we are set, which is the fact that Delphi is a daughter and not a son, which seems to be structured to surprise us.
Yeah. So I need to admit that it surprised me. I think I mentioned this to you when we were recording last time, but we didn't put it in the episode because it was a big spoiler. But the whole time I was reading, I was like, Delphi's got to be someone. I wonder who she is. there's something up with Delphi. Meanwhile, a subplot about who Voldemort's child might be is happening, and I never put those two together because I am so steeped in the expectations of patriarchy that it never occurred to me that Delphi could be Voldemort's daughter. That was a reveal.
Because you think, you know, the child of Voldemort, the heir of Voldemort, and when you think of an heir, you think of a son.
Yeah.
Because that's how inheritance has worked.
Yeah.
Like in the history of our patriarchal culture. That the one who inherits things is obviously a male child.
Yeah.
I do agree with what some listeners have proposed, which is that that was being deliberately played on. You were being deliberately set up to assume masculinity so that it could be a surprise when it turned out to be Delphi.
Yeah.
And I actually cannot remember now whether I was surprised or not. I remember suspecting that it was her before it was revealed, but I also know that I have a tendency to retcon these things in my own head.
Okay.
And like once I actually know how a narrative turned out, to then go back and be like, I always knew that was how it was going to turn out.
Right.
So that's why I often record my reading process as I'm going to like keep myself reliable. I was telling you earlier that I often record where I cry as I'm reading, because after the fact I like won't remember having felt that way in that scene. So so I actually can't say one way or the other, but like I absolutely agree with some listeners' reading of that as having been set up to surprise us. Do you think that there's any other significance in her being a daughter, not a son?
So what I think is really interesting about that question is that I think that for some people it is really significant that it's a daughter, not a son. For me, it doesn't matter. Like,
I don't see gender.
I don't see it. I'm gender blind. No, I guess for me, like, it's not like a striking narrative change for it to be a daughter. It doesn't shake up my worldview. Even though I was able to be surprised by it, I'm almost like embarrassed that I was surprised by it.
And it's not like this is a series that has had a lack of significant female characters.
Exactly, yeah. But I can totally see how this would be a really significant world shaking up for some people who are able to see strong, powerful women as villains in the form of Dolores Umbridge, who is like an undersecretary. But to actually bring Voldemort back, or to, for all intents and purposes, be the next Voldemort, for that to be a female character, I can see how that would like be really remarkable for some people.
Yeah, I mean, it is nice. I am glad that they like shook up the sort of main heroes and villains are always men thing, reminding us that like women also have boundless capacities for evil. White feminists and white feminism can sometimes get very comfy in the like, women have also been oppressed, therefore we cannot be the oppressors. That dynamic, which is bullshit, because white women have absolutely strategically sided with white supremacy in incredibly violent ways, and with colonialism and imperialism and all kinds of terrible things. So to have Delphi as our villain, I think, is an important reminder that like white women can still do really monstrous things.
Yeah, totally agree.
And can absolutely side themselves with these really violent systems. So just in case we needed that reminder.
Final question?
Final question.
Okay. Hannah, who is the cursed child?
I think that this is deliberately ambiguous.
What?
Yes.
Oh my God.
I think it's meant to be legible as applicable to multiple characters in the book. I think on one level, it's evoking the question of who is Voldemort's heir, right? Like the cursed child was Voldemort's heir. But we're also, I think, encouraged to read the cursed child as being Albus, who's sort of living under the oppressive memory of his father. The cursed child is Scorpius, both because he is maybe Voldemort's heir and because whether or not he is, that's also the curse he's living under. And the cursed child is Delphi because the inheritance that she has, whether real or just something she's been told, as it turns out, it doesn't matter, because she is also living under that. And then we can sort of expand it outwards. The cursed child was Harry, the cursed child was Draco. Like, so many of these characters are cursed children in the sense that they were set up in these situations that like damaged them in ways that they will carry with them through their lives.
Ooh, I think the cursed child could also be Panju because he doesn't exist anymore.
It's only Panju. No, you found the answer. It's him. Nailed it.
He only exists under a certain set of circumstances and so briefly, and now no more.
Aren't we all the cursed child?
Good question, Hannah. Good question.
And it's interesting to then compare that to the cover art, which is so different from the cover art of all of the other books in all the other editions, because the cover art has a tendency to be very literal.
Yeah.
To be images from the story, particular scenes, whereas this is figurative. There is no child in a nest.
That's true. I mean, unless it's Delphi.
It's affiliated with Delphi because of the bird imagery, for sure.
Yeah.
Right? She's the augury. And I think that's the strongest reading, is that Delphi is the cursed child. But the figurativeness of that image, combined with the fact that the phrase cursed child was never uttered in the play, I think deliberately leaves it much more open than any of the other book titles, which all refer to very, very specific things. Thanks, dear listeners, for joining us for episode 15B of Witch Please. The rest of our episodes are, as always, available at awitchplease.ca. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes or whatever platform you prefer. While you're at it, don't forget to rate or review us. It's the second best form of advertising. You know what the best form is? Declaring your nerdery far and wide by sporting a sweet piece of merch. Take a look at society6.com/ohwitchplease or the link on our website to see what's available.
Special thanks as always to Trevor Chow Fraser, our erstwhile tech support and the robot of our hearts.
Hi, how are you doing?
And extra special thanks to everyone who's been tweeting at us.
Dun, dun, dun.
Jade Constable, Last Ald, Ms. Megan, Cyclone Chloe, Ephion G, Strictly Pod, El Borgon, Kristalla P, Scriptorium Girl, Caveats Decorum, Taylor W. Driggers, Oswin, Team Hobbyhorse, The Ace DB, Asha Hurton, Kiss Me Hardy, Rach, Vic Jones, Stephocracy, SG Wingo, Sarah Sherwood, Laura Bang, PGH in Red, Say Wooster, Triceratop, Molly Flood, Kingslam, Mars's Wisdom, Matt L.A. Schneider, A Gold Ship, Virginia Wolf, Just Malins, Yasmin Hilliam, Emma H. Barker, Instant Dreams, Duchess Cadbury, Sophie Biblio, Karina Saurus, All of the Things, Lily Actually, Ranged Lunatic, McKinney James, Mad Peterson, Smarakuya, Veronica UK, Student of Wim, Masha Dutois, Army Boy 0787, Rosie Morgan 96, JG Fool, Amanda Finlaw, Natalia Kismet, Chillin Kristen, Anna Mulligan 7, Pewter Wolf 13, HP Sacred Text, Mayal, Nana Luna, MW Boyce, Hello Alex, Tamar Atkinson, Mimi Roning, Sophie Peppy, Curious Fox Books, H. Cassidy, Bronwyn Fay, Ashley R. Guillory, Katarina Hoven, Emily Hoven, X626, Mad Hat 106, Liz Faw, Honking Daffodil, Alan Matley, She Makes Podcast, Alyssa KB, Mar Shameless, which is my stage name, Fandom's Teapot, Liza Kate, All Mad Here 27, CC Streeter, RK McKinnon, Ever Sarah, Mara Bobera, Morose Hannah, The Lulu True, Terry Lee McGarry, After 3, Pytra Noof, Jess O'Callahan, Heidi Pett, Sasha Purvis, Random Hyper One, Claire Rousseau, Jenny Cecile, Lavenderist, Ud Book, Foggy Day Studio, Hello Jenny Tao, Theo Potterhead, Bellu397, Courtney Alize, Hello Ali J, Nakona 89, Pow Pow 13, V Vigneux, Dwindle Bunny, Alexandra Koch, Livy Flynn, Beth HMW, Rent a Good Book, BR Papa, Sweet Love Books, Chloe Mercer, Space Hamster, Master Sen Senpai, Akiko Tree 8, Trixie Dalek, Megan Andy, Are You Listening? Elsie Kate 10, Slither Clawgy, Amy Liz, Schneider Ann C, The Purple Coffee, I Am Golden Holden, Women at Warp, Meryl Kate, Seepers D, My Book Jacket, Lee Bick, Sierra Love, Monobo, Pink Lemonade, Jane Burgess, Hannah Jade, Rosemary Pip, Kat Morissette, Thomas J. Bayless, Sophs Why Not, Emily Sargent, Caitlin Sykes, Amy Ripley, J.V. Purcell, Literary Elena, Rinnick 88, Lloyd Pancakes, and Moon of Morris. I really thought that the Twitter list would be shorter this time. I was wrong.
We are back in minisode mode for a while, witches, so this is a good time to let us know if there are any topics you're just burning for us to touch on.
Sexy.
But until then,
Later, witches.